Welcome to the Trinity podcast. My name is Nick Price, and this is a new midweek series that we are starting to help us further reflect on what we've been learning on the weekends and to really consider what is God's word saying to us throughout the week. And as we're starting a new series in the book of Exodus, I thought it would be a good idea to invite a guest to join us. And so we are privileged to have Dr. John Walton joining us on the podcast to talk a little bit about the book of Exodus. He is a professor of Old Testament studies at Wheaton College and is here to just help us get into this book a little bit. So John, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us.
It's a great book and I love talking about it.
Wonderful. Well, one of the things that I thought we would do with this first episode is really take a step back and consider the importance of this book as a whole. One of the things I love about reading the Bible is how so many of the biblical writers seem to be in dialogue with each other. And when it comes to the Exodus story, we see many other biblical authors referring back to it. We hear echoes of it in the Psalms, in the writings of the prophets. Even the New Testament writers frame Jesus and his ministry in light of some of these Old Testament themes, but specifically some of the things we find in the Exodus story. So I wanted to just start by asking, what is it about this book in particular that's so significant? What does it contribute to our understanding of God, of his story, that maybe we would miss if we didn't have it?
Well, most people have origin stories. Most nations, most people groups, and even families, as they do their family history, they have origin stories that help tell them who they are. And that's what the book of Exodus is for Israel. It's their origin story. I mean, we like to think about Genesis as an origin story, and in many ways it is. But origin stories are more than just history. They are identity. They help tell people who they are and what their values are and how they view themselves, their perceptions that they want to project to the world. And so origin stories are extremely important, and that's what the book of Exodus does for Israel.
So how is it different from maybe the story that we find, in Genesis about Abraham, where we first hear kind of this relationship being established with this family? What is added in Exodus or expanded on in Exodus that we don't quite get from that portion of the origin story?
Right. So with Abraham and his descendants, in Genesis, we have a family origin story, and that ties to clans and tribes and things of that sort. It ties to the concept of covenant in a family sort of way. When we get to Exodus, now they've become a nation. And so this is their origins as a nation. And likewise, it picks up the covenant theme, and now not just a clan or tribal covenant connected to a family and descendants, but rather now a covenant with a nation. And so Israel takes its national identity from this book and the events that are here. It's not disconnected to Genesis, but it certainly gives us a new step.
Mm-hmm. And I know that one of the things you've mentioned in some of the training that we've done with our leaders is how this idea of relationship is so central, and specifically the relationship between this now nation, not just family, but nation of people and their God, Yahweh. So what is it that we learn about God in Exodus that, again, expands the story and furthers what we've already seen in the book of Genesis?
When you move to the idea of God being in covenant relationship, now not just with a family, but with a nation, the idea of kingship emerges much more clearly. And when God makes a covenant with Israel, he is not just identifying himself as their God, he's identifying himself as their king. And he acts like their king, and they are supposed to respond to him as their king. And so in that sense, it adds that theological element, which you really don't pick up very much in Genesis.
Mm. So what kind of king is he? How does he reveal his kingship to them? What are some of the aspects of his character that begin to emerge as we get into the narrative?
Well, certainly one is his power, and that's shown clearly in the opening narratives in the book of Exodus. but then also his desire for relationship. The very fact that he makes a covenant with them makes them his covenant people. Covenant is a relational concept. And so it shows him to be the kind of king who is acting among his people and, of course, eventually living among his people, which is what the tabernacle is all about. So he's not going to rule from afar. He's ruling from among them.
Just continuing to think about that idea of covenant, I think that that's a word that people often hear but don't really understand. What is a covenant when we start to think, especially in more that ancient Near Eastern context? And is there anything unique about the covenant that God makes with Israel that sets it apart from what we would see in the wider world at that time?
Well, a covenant's a formal agreement between parties. And lots of times in the ancient world, it shows up in things like treaties, where one king makes a treaty with other kings, or more often, a kind of leading king makes other kings his vassals. And so vassal treaties are one of the forms that it takes. And so that idea of kingship in relationship is the important common ingredient. But there's discontinuity with the rest of the ancient world because there's no place else where we have a God making a covenant relationship with a people group. In the ancient world, gods usually made covenants with kings. And so there's a relationship, a patronage relationship between the god and the king. And then the king is supposed to represent the god to the people and the people to the god. And so we have that role that's played by the king. And here that's all democratized. It's all, it's the entire people that stand in relationship to God. So that's what makes it rather unique in the ancient world.
So I know that we're talking about a text that was written probably 3,000 years ago, very different linguistic context, very different cultural context, and in some ways even very different theological contexts. How do we as Christians today see this as a story that, although it was written to this set of people, it's still written for us and for our benefit? What does it mean for us to see Exodus as a part of the story that we now find ourselves being a part of?
Well, that's the whole issue of knowing what we're looking for and knowing what the Bible is supposed to be giving us. And of course, I've been able to talk about this on numerous occasions, that the Bible's not just a how-to book to tell us what to do. I think lots of times people think the authority of the Bible is understood that it can tell us what to do and we have to do it. Mm-hmm. Because we think of authority that way, whether it's employers or parents or governments, we think in terms of performance. It has the authority to command us. And sometimes it's easy to think about the Bible that way, that its authority is to tell us what to do. And certainly there are things the Bible tells us which we should do. Don't get me wrong on that. But that's not really what it's there for. Its main mode is not performance. Because otherwise, people get the idea that, so I need to know everything I need to do so I can be in favor with God and so I can get his blessings. Okay, and that ends up being very me-focused. So I'd like to help get beyond that, that it's not just authority to tell you to do things. It's rather the authority to tell us about what God is doing in the world. And so that's why I talk about it as God's story. And it's not Israel's story or Moses' story. It's the story of what God was doing as he began to give shape to his plans and purposes in the world. And so that's where we get to the idea of, so how am I supposed to respond to it? See, we should think in terms of faithful reading, but also faithful response. Mm-hmm. What is a faithful response? And it's not just obedience to commands we happen to find, if we can figure out what we're supposed to do with them, but rather it's about the idea that our faithful response is responding to what God is doing in the world and trying to be part of that.
So again, as a modern, reader looking back, studying this as a Christian today, what would be some faithful responses that maybe we could have to this book? What is the significance and its ongoing implications for us today as we think about our own relationship with God and what it means to be a part of that story?
Well, our faithful response, again, comes in terms of finding our place in God's story. And we can learn to do that from a book like Exodus as we come to understand how his story unfolds, how he tends to work out his plans and purposes. And it may look different in our day than it looked in their day, but the idea that we are supposed to be participants in it. That means, for instance, that we don't respond by whining and complaining when things aren't the way we want them to be. There are things that we see that God worked past those things, but that didn't work to the benefit of those people. Now, that doesn't mean that the Israelites become models for us of what to do and not to do, but the idea that we can see what it is that God is up to and think about how we can positively be part of what he's doing. Exodus is just the beginning of a story. It was the beginning of Israel's story in many ways. And that, of course, branches into Jesus' story and the church's story and our own stories. So finding our place in the story is, I think, the way that we are supposed to respond faithfully.
Can you give me some examples of maybe ways not to do that you've seen? And then maybe a couple of examples of perhaps a more faithful way of reading and responding to the story.
Sometimes we look at the specific things in Israel and try to pick up those specifics, whether it's something like boiling a kid in his mother's milk or not boiling a kid in his mother's milk, or somehow hoping for plagues on our enemies or things of that sort. Or go out and build your own tabernacle in the wilderness. It's certainly not those things.
Sure.
It's not trying to be Israel. Okay, and so those are some of the things that can point us the wrong direction. Certainly also, it's not a situation where we should be thinking that we can stand in judgment on God, evaluating his actions in light of our own modernist sensibilities and what they are. So that's another way not to do it. We are not in a position to hold God accountable. Sometimes his actions confuse us, but we need to just keep gathering information and gathering perspectives. So those are some of the ways that we wouldn't necessarily do it. The ways that we would do it would be to think about how God is in relationship with us in the new covenant and what we need to do to be his people, reflecting his glory, reflecting his nature, and being accurate mirrors of him in the world in which we live. We can start thinking about the presence of God. It's not in a constructed building today, it's in his people, but yet the presence of God is still something that is a reality and something that we should be prepared to reflect, prepared to act on. The Israelites went to a lot of trouble to make that tabernacle and prepare it well for the presence of God. How careful are we about how our lives and our actions and decisions are prepared to reflect the presence of God? So those are some things I would think of.
I really like that idea of the care and the attention that they took to preparing the tabernacle. We'll talk about this in a later episode, but thinking about if that was true then of that tent, of that place, what implications does that have now when we're told in the New Testament, now you are the dwelling place of God. You are his people. You are a holy temple. You are the dwelling place of his spirit. I just think that's a great point of reflection to encourage people to
well, what was interesting, and again, we can get into this at a later time, but what was interesting is that they were trying to make that structure the very best that it could be. All the best quality materials as they understood best. Some of them we might look at and say, oh, I would have used leather, whatever, I don't know. But what was the best in their world. And too often today, I think we find Christians saying, what's the least I can get by with? Instead of shooting for the high bar, they shoot for the low bar. What are the things I just have to be careful not to do, and then I'll be okay. That's really not the way to go about it.
So what would your hope be for anybody who's reading this book? What would you hope that they would walk away from Exodus with?
I would want them to come away admiring what God has done for his people. Being in awe of a God who desires to be in relationship, and to be ready to worship a God who dwells among them, and really is condescending to be among people. So I would hope that people would get a greater appreciation for that.
Well, thank you for helping hopefully set us up to read this book well. And I look forward to seeing where our conversation is going to go over the next several weeks. And I know we're going to have you back on to unpack a couple of other specific sections of the book.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Trinity podcast. We hope this week's message encouraged you to consider the claims of Jesus in a new way, and we would love to have you join us for worship on the weekend. To find a location near you, visit www.tlc4u.org.